Imagine standing in a ballroom filled with the most powerful people in New York. You're 30 years old, 7 months pregnant, wearing a blue silk dress, and your hand rests on your belly as you watch the man you love walk onto that stage. The cameras flash, the applause swells. You smile, waiting for him to thank you. His wife, the mother of his child. But instead, he reaches for another woman. A beautiful brunette steps up beside him. He pulls her close, looks into the crowd, and announces she is his partner in business and in life. The applause dies. The whispers begin, and as hundreds of eyes turn to the pregnant woman frozen in the crowd, your husband doesn't even glance your way. What would you do? Would you scream? Would you collapse? Or would you walk out of that ballroom with your head held high, carrying one single promise inside your heart? That he would never, ever find you again. My name is Olivia Bennett. That night, I lost everything. But what my husband didn't know was that the woman he humiliated in front of the world was about to become the reason his empire fell to ashes. This is the story of a betrayal that shook Wall Street, a secret that destroyed a billionaire, and a mother who rose from the ruins stronger than anyone ever imagined. Because sometimes, the woman a man throws away is the woman who finally breaks him. If stories of courage, karma, and unstoppable women move your heart, don't forget to hit that like button, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Your support means everything. Now let's begin. Outside, the city lights were just a blur. I leaned against a wall, trying to catch my breath in the cold air. My whole life, that beautiful life I thought I had, it all came crashing down right then. It was more than just betrayal. It was like I'd been completely erased, just tossed aside. I pressed my hand to my belly and whispered, "I won't let him do this to us." My voice was shaky, but a different feeling started to grow inside me, something stronger than all the pain. It was right there, in that moment, that I decided I would vanish from his world. And if he ever came looking for us, he wouldn't find a trace. I mean, Olivia Bennett never thought she'd end up as a headline. To everyone else, I was the elegant wife of Alexander Grant, the biggest name on Wall Street. But behind all that, I was still just a girl from a small town in Ohio. My mom raised me by herself, working 2 jobs just so we could get by. I learned very early what it meant to sacrifice, to be humble, and to hold on to your dignity, especially when life tries to knock you down. At 30, I wasn't some socialite craving the spotlight. I was an interior designer. I loved making spaces feel warm and safe for families. My work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Every couch or paint color I chose was about making a house a home. And that's all I ever really wanted for myself. A family, a home that was filled with love, not just expensive things. When I first met your father, it felt like he was the answer to a prayer. He was older, so sure of himself, so successful. He swept me off my feet with this whirlwind romance, all roses and fancy dinners and promises made under the city lights. For a girl like me, who'd always had to fight for everything, it felt like a fairy tale. He said I was his muse, the one who made him believe in love. I trusted him with my whole heart, even when my friends warned me that men like him love power more than people. I tried so hard to be the perfect wife those first few years. I learned how to handle myself at those fancy parties, how to smile for the cameras, and how to ignore the gossip columns that criticized everything about me. I just kept holding on to the idea that our marriage was real, not just for show. And when I found out I was pregnant with you, I thought that was it. I thought that would be the moment he'd finally soften, that we would finally become the family I'd always dreamed of. But being pregnant wasn't easy. I had rough nights and dizzy mornings and so many quiet afternoons alone in that big penthouse while he was always too busy at work. He hardly ever asked how I was feeling. His life was just meetings and business deals and late-night calls that made me wonder if work was the only thing on his mind. I kept telling myself he'd change once he held you in his arms. I even painted your nursery myself, with soft yellows and tiny little stars on the ceiling. Every single brushstroke was like a wish for our future. I even had a little journal where I wrote letters to you about all the things we would do, the stories we'd read, and the simple, happy times I never had growing up. But deep down, I had this nagging feeling that something was very wrong. The light in his eyes was gone when he looked at me. His touch felt distant. I told myself I was just being hormonal, but the fear was always there. And that fear became my reality on the night he chose another woman over me in front of the whole world. As I walked out of that ballroom, I knew a different kind of fight was just beginning. The world your father built was all glass and steel and blinding lights. From the outside, it looked like a fortress. Our penthouse was at the very top of a skyscraper, with these huge windows looking out over all of Manhattan. Every night, the skyline sparkled, but to me, honey, it just felt like a cage. That apartment had every luxury you could imagine. Marble countertops, giant crystal chandeliers, a closet, bigger than the first apartment my mom and I shared. Everything about it was meant to scream success and power. When people came over, they'd just stare at the view and tell me how lucky I was. But when they left, the loneliness in that place was deafening. Your father loved that world. It was all boardrooms and private jets and fancy parties for him. At his headquarters on Wall Street, he was treated like a god. His employees were terrified of him, always scrambling not to let him down. And Madison Clark, she knew exactly how to navigate that world. She played her part so well, always laughing at his jokes, always agreeing with his ambitions, making herself seem like the only woman who understood his drive. Me, on the other hand, I felt like a ghost in those shiny offices. I remember I used to go see him, bringing him lunch I'd made, just to feel close to him for an hour. He'd just give me a polite smile and say he was too busy to eat. In his meetings, I'd sit there in the corner while Madison's laughter filled up the whole room. It was in little moments like that I started to realize I just didn't fit in his world. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because he didn't really want me there anymore. At home, all that luxury felt like it was mocking me. I could walk through 10 different rooms and still feel completely alone. The nursery I'd painted for you was the only room that felt warm. Everywhere else, the silence was just so heavy. I'd sit by the window for hours, watching people on the streets below, envying them for just being normal. They looked so much more alive than I ever felt in my golden prison. The truth is, your father loved the idea of things more than the things themselves. He loved how the cameras would follow us, how the magazines would write about his perfect life. I was a part of that perfect picture, right up until I wasn't. Once Madison was there, I became invisible, even in my own home. That night at the gala wasn't just a humiliation. It was the moment I realized I had been replaced a long, long time before he ever said it out loud. Madison was already living the life that was supposed to be mine. That penthouse, which I once thought was my home, suddenly felt like I was trespassing. I looked around at all the cold, perfect things and made myself a promise. I would not raise you in a beautiful home that was built on lies and betrayal. I decided I would leave that glittering prison, even if I had to start all over with absolutely nothing. Because you know, sweetheart, sometimes your freedom is worth more than every diamond in the city. Your father, Alexander Grant, he wasn't always the man who would shame his wife in front of a crowd. When I met him, He was charming and persuasive, the kind of person who could make you believe anything was possible. That's how he built his whole empire, with sheer confidence and a terrifying refusal to ever fail. But, honey, your father's drive was something I once admired. But over time, it soured into a kind of cold arrogance. People became pieces on his chessboard, just steps to his next big win. It started slowly with me, of course. He'd listen to my design ideas. He even came to see an apartment I'd finished. But as his world got bigger, that support vanished. My work was small, next to his billion-dollar deals. He'd say business was a man's world. To everyone else, he was the perfect husband. But at home, his words cut me to pieces. And that's when Madison Clark found her opening. She was everything you'd expect. Young, gorgeous, and fiercely ambitious. But where I talked about creating warm, loving homes, she talked about power and branding. She saw his hunger for what it was and knew exactly how to feed it. Every word of praise, every smile, was a performance meant to convince him she was the real prize. At first, she was smart enough not to disrespect me to my face. She played the part of his biggest supporter. But behind the scenes, she was carefully, methodically erasing me from his life. She'd fill his calendar so he'd miss our doctor appointments. She'd plant little seeds of doubt in his mind, whispering that I just didn't have the right image for him anymore. And he started to believe it all. He came home later and later, smelling of a perfume that wasn't mine. When I asked questions, he'd get angry, calling me paranoid or hormonal. He made me think I was losing my mind. That was his real talent, you see. Not just the betrayal itself, but making me feel like it was my fault. By the night of the gala, he wasn't the man I'd married at all. He had become a complete stranger. A man so full of himself that he could stand on a stage and discard his pregnant wife like she was last season's coat. Madison never had to lift a finger. She just stood there, glowing, while he did all the dirty work. In his eyes, I had already disappeared, and to her, I was already beaten. But they both forgot one thing. I was carrying you, and that gave me a strength neither of them could ever comprehend. The woman they thought was broken was about to start over. A new story where his ego and her scheming would eventually implode. When that empire they built on our heartbreak started to shake, I would be the one left standing. That gala was supposed to be a wonderful night. I remember picking out a beautiful blue dress that flowed right over my bump. I had this silly hope that he'd look at me and remember us, remember the life we were creating. Instead, he made me the star of his public betrayal. When he pulled Madison on stage, my whole world just stopped. The applause was scattered, uncertain. People knew something was wrong. The cameras flashed, catching her victorious smile and his hand holding hers so tightly. I felt all the color drain from my face. A buzzing started in my ears, and it blocked out everything else. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. All around me, the whispers started. "Isn't his wife right there?" one woman said. "She's pregnant," another gasped behind her hand. Men just shook their heads. The women gave me these looks of pity. I just wanted to disappear. I turned, making each movement slow and careful, terrified I might fall apart right there. My hand went to my belly, a reflex to shield you from all that ugliness. I didn't cause a scene. I didn't scream. I just walked out of that ballroom. Every step on that marble floor felt so loud, so full of shame. And he never once called my name. Madison didn't even blink. It was done. Outside, the cold New York air hit me like a slap in the face. I was clutching my purse so hard, my knuckles were white, trying to catch my breath. The city lights blurred through my tears, but I wouldn't let myself cry. Not out there for anyone to see. I raised a shaky hand for a cab. The driver looked at my face in the rearview mirror and asked, "You okay, miss?" I just nodded, trying to keep my voice from breaking. "Brooklyn," was all I could manage to say. In the quiet of that back seat, I finally let go. The tears just poured out, soaking my dress. I leaned my forehead against the cool window and watched the city blur past. Every building seemed to mock me, reminding me of him. I thought about the nursery I'd so lovingly painted, the journal I'd filled with letters to you. I had dreamed of telling you stories about your wonderful, strong father. Now that dream was in pieces. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to soothe you, whispering, "I'll protect you. I don't know how, but I will. You deserve so much better." My voice was a wreck, but in all that hurt, a tiny spark of resolve ignited. The taxi pulled up to a simple brick building in Brooklyn, a universe away from Manhattan's glamour. I paid the driver, my hands still trembling, and stepped out. That beautiful gown now just felt heavy and damp with my sadness. I had no idea what would happen next. All I knew, with a certainty that cut through the fog, was that I was done being ignored. From the ashes of that night, someone new was going to have to emerge. Those first nights in Brooklyn were the loneliest I've ever known. I went from marble floors to peeling wallpaper in a tiny apartment that always smelled a little damp. It was just one small room with a squeaky bed, the opposite of the life I'd known. And yet, for the first time in so long, I felt like I was in charge of my own life, even if I was terrified. I kept the curtains drawn, paranoid someone from his world would see me. Your father was everywhere. On the news, in magazines, I couldn't bear to see his face. The quiet in that little room was deafening. The nights were the worst. I'd sit on the bed, holding my belly, and talking to you because there was no one else. "It's just us now," I'd whisper. "I don't know how we're going to do this, but I promise I'll try." Eating felt like a chore. I'd just pick at toast or soup, forcing myself to swallow for your sake. Some days, I'd forget to take my vitamins. I was just that lost. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, pale, with puffy eyes and messy hair, a ghost of the person I used to be. The shame of that night was a physical weight on my chest, heavier than you were inside me. I kept replaying it in my mind over and over until it haunted my sleep. Madison's smug smile, his hand on her arm, while I stood there, invisible. The humiliation was a fire that burned day and night. But underneath all that pain, something else began to bubble up. Pure anger. It started quietly. I thought of all the years I'd given him, the dreams I'd set aside. I remembered painting your nursery and writing you letters, and I realized that while he'd taken so much, he hadn't taken you. You were still mine. One night, I made myself open that journal. My hand was shaking when I started to write, but the words felt like medicine. "You are why I have to fight," I wrote. "What he did won't break us. We will build something new." It wasn't exactly strength. Not yet, but it was the beginning of it. I was falling apart in that little apartment, but deep in the cracks, something resilient was starting to grow. And then, fate sent a little help my way. After 3 weeks of hiding, I finally went to a doctor's appointment. I couldn't put your health at risk any longer. I threw on an old sweater and hoped I looked anonymous enough to get by. The waiting room was filled with other moms-to-be, and I tried to shrink into a corner, praying no one would look twice at me. When my name was called, I got up and kept my head down, and that's when I heard it, a voice I knew. "Olivia, Olivia Bennett." My heart just about stopped. I turned around and my jaw dropped. I almost couldn't breathe, because standing right there was Daniel Hayes. It felt like a lifetime since I'd last seen him, back when he was just this passionate law student who wanted to save the world. Now he was in a sharp suit, looking confident, but still so kind, and his eyes just went wide when he saw me. For a split second, honey, I thought about lying, pretending to be someone else, but he stepped closer, his face softening with worry. He knew it was me. My goodness, he said, it's been forever. I tried to smile, but my voice just broke. Daniel, I wasn't expecting you. He told me he was there consulting on a legal case for a patient. Then his eyes drifted down to my belly, and his whole expression changed. First surprise, then this deep concern. Olivia, you're pregnant. My throat just closed up. I felt this wave of shame, like I had to explain why I was alone in some little clinic while my husband was one of the most powerful men in the city. I tried to wave it away, saying it was complicated. Daniel didn't push. He just said, let's find a place to sit. You can tell me what's going on. And right then, for the first time since that awful night, I let myself talk. The words just came spilling out, a little shaky at first, then all at once. I told him all of it, about Alexander, the gala, Madison, and that lonely, silent life. The tears started, but he never looked at me with pity. He just listened, and I could see his jaw get tight and his hands clench as I told him how I'd been betrayed. When I finally ran out of words, there was this quiet between us. Then he leaned in, his voice so steady. You're not alone in this anymore. Do you understand? Whatever he did to you, whatever he took, you're not going through this by yourself. I swear, I gasped. For weeks, I'd been living like a ghost, certain I had nobody. But sitting there with an old friend who'd grown into such a good man, I felt something I thought I'd lost forever. It was relief. It wasn't some grand romance or a rescue mission. It was just a hand reaching out for me in the dark, pulling me back. I didn't know it then, of course, but Daniel showing up was just the first little crack that would eventually bring Alexander's whole world down. While I was hiding out, trying to find my footing, Alexander Grant was putting on a show with Madison Clark. Their pictures were everywhere. The powerful tycoon and his stunning new partner, all smiles at galas and fancy dinners. To everyone else, it looked like he had simply moved on to something better. But I know now that under all that gloss, his empire was already starting to splinter. Madison gave Alexander everything he wanted. She was young, beautiful, and knew how to play the game. But what she really wanted was power. She played her part so well, feeding his ego with ideas that were secretly her own, weaving herself into the fabric of his business. The papers love us, she'd say to him, showing him the glowing articles. We look invincible. But Madison was only ever loyal to herself. Every perfect smile was a move to make herself essential, the real brains of the operation. When Alexander started firing advisors he'd trusted for years because she said they were behind the times, she was thrilled. The fewer people he had in his corner, the easier he was to control. And Alexander, he was so caught up in his own vanity, he never saw the danger. He started chasing bigger, riskier deals for the publicity instead of focusing on what was stable. He ignored the warnings from his own board, shutting down anyone who dared to question his new direction. The whole company, which he'd built on such careful strategy, was now just running on ego. At home, Madison's sweet act would sometimes disappear. She'd get cold and start demanding more, always more, as if she needed constant proof of her value. And Alexander, terrified of looking weak after ditching me for her, just gave in every time. He'd made his choice in public, you see. He couldn't afford to admit he'd made a mistake. But the people who worked for him, they saw everything. The rumors started flying around the office. He's totally distracted, they'd say. Or, she's the one calling the shots now. The work started to suffer. Important deals fell through. And his rivals, They smelled blood in the water and started circling. Alexander kept pretending he was in charge. He'd stride through the office, barking orders and ignoring the looks people gave him. But deep down, he had to have felt it, that sinking feeling of a man on unstable ground. His pride had already cost him his wife and the trust of his team. It was about to cost him a whole lot more. Meanwhile, Madison was secretly meeting with his investors, painting herself as the real mind behind Grant Financial. She had this soft, smiling way about her, but her message was sharp. Alexander was past his prime, and she was the one who could lead them forward. The trap was all set, and he had no idea he was about to step right in it. For me, over in Brooklyn, all of this was invisible. But life has a funny way of connecting stories. The empire that had cast me out was starting to shake, and the cracks in his world were about to meet the new strength I was slowly building inside myself. You see, the higher he climbed with her, the more devastating the fall was going to be when the truth finally caught up with him. Life in Brooklyn was a world away from the one I'd left behind. The private cars, designer clothes, and the sweeping views of Central Park were gone. My new reality was crowded subways, thrift store finds, and long nights spent counting every dollar to make sure I had enough for rent and food. It was humbling and scary, but in a strange way, it was also freeing. Every single morning, I had to make myself get out of that bed, even when I felt so heavy with exhaustion I could barely move. Being pregnant made it all so much harder. Things you never think about, like climbing stairs or carrying groceries, suddenly felt like huge challenges. But I just kept pushing, telling myself, with every little ache, that I wasn't just doing this for me anymore. I was doing it for the little heartbeat I could feel growing stronger every day. I found a part-time job at a little neighborhood furniture store. It didn't pay much, but the owner, Mr. Rosen, was a kind old man. He gave me hours that worked for me and never asked any personal questions. "You have a good eye," he told me one afternoon as he watched me arrange a little display. "Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." Hearing him say that lit a little spark in me. Alexander had made me feel so small about my passion for design for so long, but there, in that little shop, I was reminded that my talent was real. People would stop and compliment my displays. It wasn't a big thing, but it was a piece of me I could hold on to while I was trying to put my life back together. Still, the nights were lonely. That little apartment would feel so empty. I'd just curl up on the old sofa, put my hands on my belly, and whisper to my baby, "We're going to be all right, you and me." Some nights, I actually believed it. On other nights, my voice would just tremble with uncertainty. Daniel was a rock. He'd check on me, bring by food when I was too tired to shop, and gently remind me that I had legal options against Alexander. But I just wasn't there yet. The wounds were too fresh. Just thinking about facing Alexander in court made my whole body ache with anxiety. And then one rainy afternoon, something shifted in me. I was fixing a window display when a young couple stopped outside to look. They were smiling at my work, and the woman turned to me and said, "That looks absolutely beautiful. Are you a professional interior designer?" I just stood there, completely still. It had been so long since anyone had asked me that. After a moment, I slowly nodded. Yes, I used to be. "Well," the woman said with such warmth, "you really shouldn't stop. You have a true gift." Those simple words, honey, they went straight to my heart. For the first time since that horrible night, I felt a tiny flicker of my old confidence return. It was fragile, but it was there. Maybe I wasn't completely broken. Maybe my story wasn't finished. I stepped back and saw my reflection in the window, my growing belly beneath my sweater, and I finally let myself imagine a future where my baby and I were not just surviving, but actually happy. I had no idea at the time that this fragile bit of strength I was finding was on a collision course with a much larger destiny. The nights in Brooklyn were always the hardest, though. The quiet would just settle in, leaving me alone with all the memories I was trying so hard to escape. I'd sit on the edge of that lumpy mattress, listening to the city outside, and when I closed my eyes, the past would just rush back in. I'd remember the very first time I laid eyes on Alexander. It was in an art gallery in Soho. I was there with a client, helping him pick out pieces for a loft I was designing. Alexander was like a force of nature from the second I saw him. He was tall, dressed perfectly, and his confidence seemed to fill the entire space. When our eyes met across the room, he gave me this smile that made me feel like I was the only one there. After that, he chased me with everything he had. Fancy dinners, weekend getaways he'd plan at the last minute, and bouquets of flowers so huge I could barely get them through my door. For a girl like me, who grew up watching my mom scrape by, it felt like I'd walked into a movie. I'd never been cherished like that before, never been so completely adored. I told myself it had to be love, and for a while, it really was. You know, I still remember those early days, the nights Alexander would whisper about our future while holding me, or the mornings he'd bring me coffee, made exactly right. We even laughed when we burned pancakes in that tiny first apartment of ours. I wanted to believe all those sweet moments were real. But honey, over time, the warmth just cooled. The flowers stopped coming. Our laughter at breakfast became a heavy silence. If I mentioned my work, he'd just stare at his phone. His empire was everything, and I was just part of the scenery. I tried, I really did. New dinners, new dresses, anything to catch his eye. But it was no use. I started feeling like a ghost in my own home. Then, when I found out I was pregnant, oh, my heart just soared. I was so sure that would be the thing to bring him back, to remind him of the man he was. I pictured him holding our baby, the two of us taking turns in the middle of the night. I thought this child would bridge the gap between us. But when I told him, his eyes never changed. He gave me this thin, far-off smile and said, "That's good," before looking right back at his email. In that 1 second, I was carrying all the joy and all the disappointment in the world. I kept telling myself it was just the stress, that everything would be different once the baby was here. Looking back from my little apartment now, those memories feel like tiny cuts. The same man who promised me a lifetime had just torn me down for everyone to see. The beautiful dream I held on to had become a real nightmare. I'd press my hands to my stomach and whisper, I thought love was enough. I was so wrong. But what I didn't see then was that my story wasn't about the love I'd lost. It was about a new kind of strength I was about to find. And while I was quietly picking up the pieces in Brooklyn, Alexander Grant's kingdom was starting to crack. On the outside, he was still the king, striding through his glass towers. But I later learned that inside Grant Financial, people were whispering. Deals that used to be easy were suddenly hitting walls. His own investors were starting to doubt him. Competitors were circling, like they could smell trouble. He just laughed it off as jealousy. "They envy me," he'd tell Madison, lounging in that big penthouse. But Madison wasn't laughing anymore. She was getting antsy. For months, she had played her part perfectly. Smiling for the cameras, whispering in his ear, making him feel invincible. But she could see the cracks forming too, and so she started pulling back. Instead of holding his arm at dinners, she'd be on her phone. Instead of telling him he was a genius, she'd sigh and point out all the risks he was ignoring. "You should have listened to me," she snapped at him one night, after another deal went south. "You're getting sloppy, Alexander. People are laughing at you." Her words must have cut him deep. Alexander lived on being respected, feared, and always in control. The idea of being a joke was something he couldn't handle. But instead of fixing his mistakes, he got meaner, yelling at his staff and firing anyone who had been loyal, replacing them with people who were too scared to ever question him. Madison saw all of this, of course. She started having quiet dinners with his investors, weaving her way into conversations where she presented herself as the smart one, the future. "Alexander has the vision," she'd say with that sweet smile of hers. "But vision is nothing without strategy. That's my part." Her eyes would sparkle, and you couldn't deny her charm. Little by little, those powerful people started listening to her more than they listened to him. At the same time, the gossip columns started digging. Rumors of his bad decisions and money troubles began to leak. The man they once called a genius was now being painted as reckless and impulsive, all because of his obsession with his mistress. He would throw newspapers across his desk, just furious. But it didn't matter what he did, he couldn't control the story anymore. At home, things got colder. Madison wasn't even pretending to be the loving partner. She wanted more power, more money, more of the credit. When he tried to put her in her place, she just gave him this cold laugh. "Your place is vanishing, Alexander. You're nothing without me." For the first time, I think, he felt true fear. He'd built his entire world on his own arrogance, believing he was untouchable. But Madison wasn't me. She wouldn't just stand by quietly. She was just as ruthless as he was, and she could smell weakness a mile away. I can just picture him pouring another drink, staring out at that city skyline that he thought he owned. The city looked the same, but he was different. He wasn't the man in charge anymore. He was a man coming apart at the seams, and Madison was the one pulling the threads. And while he was so busy trying to save his crumbling empire, he had no clue that Olivia, the wife he threw away, was quietly finding her own strength, getting ready to step out of the shadows he'd put her in. Daniel Hayes was always a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was telling him there was something rotten inside Alexander Grant's empire. Every time I told him a story about Alexander, the arrogance, the secrets, those late-night phone calls, Daniel sensed there was something more going on. And now, as a lawyer who helped people who'd been wronged, he knew how to find it. He didn't tell me what he was doing at first. I was still so fragile then, just trying to get through each day while being pregnant. But Daniel knew that if Alexander was as reckless as he seemed, the truth could be the only thing to protect me. So he started making quiet phone calls, cashing in favors with old friends on Wall Street, and poring over financial records late at night. It really didn't take him long to see the problems. On paper, Grant Financial looked perfect, but Daniel noticed things that didn't add up. Fake companies, offshore bank accounts, and trades that happened at very convenient times, right around Alexander's big announcements. To most people, it would look like nothing, but to Daniel, it was a huge red flag for market manipulation. The big break came from an old friend from college, an analyst who slipped him a private report. "I probably shouldn't be showing you this," the friend whispered to him. "But you're right. Grant has been cooking the books, hiding his losses and moving money around. If this gets out, he's done for." Daniel's heart must have been pounding as he read through that report. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was full-blown fraud. If it came out, Alexander wouldn't just lose his company. He could go to prison. But there was more than just bad finances in there. Hidden in those files was the proof linking Madison to all of it. She wasn't just his girlfriend. She was his partner in crime. That whole image of her being a supportive advisor was just a cover for her own ambition. Daniel leaned back in his chair and just breathed. He was holding the weapon that could bring Alexander down, but for him, it wasn't about revenge. It was about getting justice. I had been thrown away, humiliated, and practically erased. This evidence could give me my life back and secure my child's future. The only question was when to use it. If he moved too soon, Alexander's power might crush it. But if he waited too long, Madison might find a way to escape and leave him to take the fall. Daniel had to be smart. That evening, he came to my apartment. I was on the couch, rubbing my belly, just feeling tired but peaceful. He didn't show me the papers, not yet. He just said, "Olivia, I'm going to need you to trust me. I've found something that could change everything for you and the baby." My eyes went wide, a mix of fear and sudden hope. Change everything? How? Daniel paused for a moment, then put his hand on mine. "Well, let's just say," he said, "that Alexander isn't as powerful as he wants everyone to think he is." For the very first time, I saw a little flicker of justice on the horizon. The man who had shattered my world might finally have to face what he'd done. And though I didn't know the details yet, the proof Daniel was holding was about to turn Alexander's entire empire to ash. For weeks, I had been living like a ghost, just hiding from the world, too hurt to even think about the future. But the night Daniel told me about Alexander's lies, something deep inside me shifted. For the first time since he left, I realized I wasn't helpless. I had the one thing Alexander never thought I'd find: the truth. The next morning, I looked at myself in the cracked bathroom mirror. I barely recognized the woman I saw, so pale, with tired eyes and messy hair. For months, all I'd seen was weakness. But that morning, I saw a chance. I put my hand on my belly and whispered, "We deserve better than this, and I'm going to fight for it." I started putting my life back together, one little piece at a time. It started small. I'd brush my hair every morning, put on clothes that made me feel a little more like myself, and I started writing down my goals in a journal. I made myself eat right, take my vitamins, and walk around the block, even on the days I just wanted to stay in bed. Every one of those small things was like a tiny rebellion against the sadness that had taken over my life. Daniel was my rock through all of it. He helped me, not just with the legal stuff, but with everything else too. "You are so much stronger than you think," he'd tell me. And his words were like planting seeds, you know? They slowly grew into courage. I also went back to my first love, design. At the furniture store, I started giving customers little tips, sketching out room ideas on spare bits of paper. It all started small, with this lovely couple who hired me to decorate their tiny apartment. It wasn't some grand job, but seeing the pure joy on their faces when I finished, honey, I felt proud for the first time in what felt like forever. I remembered I was still capable, still good at what I do, and more than just the woman he'd cast aside. Day by day, that feeling of being a victim just faded away, and this fire started growing inside me. I began looking in mirrors again, and instead of apologies, I started making promises to you. I'd show you your mother was a fighter. Then Daniel came and laid all that proof out on our kitchen table. It was stack after stack of his crimes, fraud, corruption, all of it. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from this incredible sense of purpose. I knew right then it was my chance, not just to get out from under his shadow, but to stand up in front of everyone who had watched me fall. I remember looking at Daniel, my voice steady, and saying, "I'm ready to fight. For me, for my baby, for the woman he thought he had destroyed." In that moment, for the first time since that awful night, I felt my spine straighten. I wasn't the discarded wife anymore. I was a warrior, and your grandfather had no idea what was coming. So, the boardroom at Grant Financial was this imposing place, all glass and steel, high above the city. I heard later that the executives were all whispering nervously that morning when Alexander stormed in, looking perfect and furious. Word had gotten out about his bad deals, and the investors were getting restless. He slammed a folder on the table and snarled something about reminding the world who was in charge. But just as he was about to start his big speech, the doors opened, and every single person turned to look. Everything went completely silent, and in I walked. I wasn't the fragile thing that had run from the gala. I'd made sure my hair was perfect, my clothes were sharp, and my back was straight. I carried myself with a calm I hadn't felt in years, one hand resting on my belly, and my eyes locked right on his. He was speechless, for once. "Olivia," he mumbled, like my name was a forbidden word. All the executives were just looking, back and forth, confused, and Madison, sitting right next to him, went stiff as a board. She never expected me. I watched her fake smile flicker as I walked right up to that big table, my heels clicking on the floor. "I'm not here to make a scene," I said, my voice carrying through the quiet room. "I'm here because I have something to say, and I suggest you all listen." I placed a folder on the table. All of Daniel's proof, perfectly organized. Whispers started up around the room. Alexander's face lost all its color. "What is this?" he demanded. "The truth," I told him. "The truth about your offshore accounts, your fake reports, and the empire you built on nothing but lies." I looked at every person in that room. "And the truth," I added, "about how you cast off your wife and unborn child to parade your mistress around." You could hear the gasps. Madison tried to interrupt, but I just turned my gaze on her, sharp and cold. "You've played your role very well, Madison. But the board should know just how involved you were in his corruption. You weren't just his public partner, you were his partner in crime." Her face went beet red, that perfect mask of hers finally cracking. The men looked at each other, then started flipping through the pages, their eyes growing wider with every line they read. Alexander's fists were clenched. "You think you can just walk in here and—" "Yes," I cut him off, my voice firm. "I can, because you underestimated me. You thought humiliation would silence me, but you forgot who I am." I put a hand on my belly, on you. "I'm a mother now, and I won't let my child's future be tainted by your lies." The silence after that was deafening. He had nothing to say, and right then they all saw it. I wasn't the broken wife anymore. I was the storm that was about to bring him to his knees. Then the room just erupted into chaos. As all those executives were poring over the evidence, Alexander's face turned a deep, furious red. His whole image of being in control was just shattering. "This is nonsense," he yelled, slamming a hand on the table. "She's a bitter woman making up lies to ruin me." He glared at me, trying that old intimidation tactic, but I didn't even flinch. "Really?" I said, my voice perfectly level. I pointed to a page. "These wire transfers to non-existent companies trace back to your accounts in the Caymans, and that is your signature right there. Explain that, Alexander." The entire room went quiet again. All eyes turned to him. Madison was shifting in her seat, looking very uncomfortable now that the spotlight was on her. An executive turned to her, asking, "Miss Clark, your name is on these documents. Would you care to explain your role?" That's when her mask finally broke. She sat up straight and said, her voice like ice, "I did what I was told. Every move was at Alexander's direction. The fraud was his, not mine." Alexander whipped his head around to face her, pure rage in his eyes. "You liar," he hissed, but she wasn't done. She leaned toward the board, playing the perfect, wronged party. "I warned him," she said. I told him this was all too reckless, but he wouldn't listen. I only followed his orders because I was pressured. The betrayal must have cut him deep. The woman he'd humiliated me for was throwing him to the wolves to save herself. He tried to get control of the room, but it was already lost. One of the board members cleared his throat, saying, "If this is true, we could be looking at a federal investigation. The shareholders will want blood." "We can't let him sink the entire company," another one added grimly. They were already planning his exit. Alexander's voice got high and desperate. "You fools can't run this without me. I built this." But I stood there, and my voice cut right through his tantrum. "You built it on lies, Alexander, and lies always collapse." Suddenly, the boardroom doors flew open, and you could hear the roar of reporters outside. Someone had already leaked the story. Camera flashes were going off, and you could feel the panic spread through the room. Madison calmly gathered her things, a sharp little smile on her face. "Good luck explaining this," she whispered to him, then just swept out of the room, leaving him there with the mess. Alexander just collapsed into his chair, his face pale. For the first time, he wasn't the hunter. He was the one being hunted. As his empire started to crumble, I walked out with my head held high. I was no longer the woman he broke. I was the one who broke him. The fallout was instant. By the time he left that building, the media storm was a hurricane, with microphones and cameras everywhere. They were shouting questions. "Mr. Grant, did you falsify records? Did you pressure Madison Clark? Where is your wife?" He just shoved through them, consumed by his own rage. I heard he stormed into his penthouse hours later, looking like a wreck. And Madison was just waiting for him, lounging with a glass of wine like nothing had happened. "You embarrassed me," he apparently growled at her. "You threw me under the bus." But she just smiled her cold smile and said, "I saved myself. You were sinking, Alexander, and I wasn't going down with you." He was seething, I'm sure, talking about everything he'd risked for her. That's when Madison stood up and laid it all out. "Let's be honest," she told him. "You used me. I used you. That was the game. But the game's over, and you lost." He got closer, furious, asking if she really thought she could make it without him. She just laughed in his face. "Oh, I know I can. The investors are already talking to me. They see me as the future. You're finished." Those words must have been like daggers, destroying his empire, his reputation, everything. It was all slipping away, and the very woman he'd chosen was delivering the final blow. I was told he reached for her, but she pulled her arm back in disgust. "Don't you ever touch me again," she snapped. "You're desperate, and it's pathetic. I wanted power, Alexander, not a broken man." With that, she grabbed her designer coat and bag and headed for the door. His voice cracked as he yelled her name, begging her not to leave him, but she never even looked back. The door slammed shut, leaving just an echo in the ruins of his life, echoing in that hollow penthouse of his. I learned later that for the first time in his life, the silence absolutely terrified him. He'd look around at all his expensive things, the marble, the gold, the view that never ended, and none of it meant a thing anymore. He had all the money in the world, but no one's respect. All that power, but not a single friend left. He destroyed me, the one person who truly loved him, only to be tossed aside by Madison, who only ever loved his ambition. He was left with nothing but the truth of what he'd done. And just as his world was ending, mine was about to begin. I remember it was late, and I was sitting at my little kitchen table, sketching out some designs. Suddenly, my hand just seized up around my pencil. A wave of pain just washed over me, so intense it almost buckled me in half. I grabbed the table, just to stay upright, my heart hammering in my chest. Everything started happening much faster than I expected. Oh, honey, a part of me was so scared. I wasn't ready, not in my heart or my head. I somehow managed to get to the phone and dial Daniel, my fingers shaking the whole time. Daniel, I managed to get out, my voice just cracking. It's time. The baby. I need you. He was there in what felt like seconds. His face was so worried, but he was trying to be strong for me. He put his arm around me, holding me up as another contraction ripped through me. I'm right here, Olivia, he said. You're not going through this by yourself. That cab ride to the hospital was just a blur of pain and fear. I squeezed Daniel's hand so hard, I'm surprised I didn't break it. All I could do was whisper, over and over, please let my baby be okay. Once we got to the hospital, it was a whirlwind of nurses and bright lights and machines beeping everywhere. It all just spun around me. I was laid back on the bed, just completely exhausted, my body aching with every wave of pain. I felt so small and fragile in that moment, but every single time I thought I couldn't go on, Daniel was there. He never left my side, just held my hand and whispered to me, breathe, Olivia. You're stronger than this. You're stronger than him. Just look at me. You can do this. His voice was my anchor. For a split second, I thought of Alexander, of his promise to be there, and how he'd left me long before this night. But then I'd look over at Daniel, so steady and sure, and I knew that who I was had nothing to do with being left behind. Those hours felt like they stretched on forever. Every contraction was a fight, and every push was a battle cry. I cried and I screamed and I begged for it to be over, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Not with the love I already felt for the little one inside me. And then, finally, after all that struggle, the most beautiful sound filled the room, a baby's cry. That sound just broke me open. Tears poured down my face as a nurse laid this tiny, perfect little person in my arms. A little girl, pink and crying with such a fierce, wonderful life. She's beautiful, Daniel whispered, and I could see he was tearing up too. I pulled her close to me, and my heart felt like it was going to burst with a love I didn't even know I was capable of anymore. You're safe now, I whispered to her. I promise. No one will ever, ever hurt you. For the first time since my world had shattered, I felt whole again. The hurt, the betrayal, it all just melted away, looking at this little miracle. And as I held my daughter, I realized my story wasn't over. It was just starting, and it was going to be brighter than I could have ever dreamed. While I was holding my new baby in that quiet little hospital room, a whole other storm was brewing across the river in Manhattan, one that Alexander couldn't control. All that proof Daniel had found, it hit the newspapers. Overnight, the headlines were just screaming his name. Grant Financial and Fraud Scandal. CEO Alexander Grant under investigation. His mistress connected to the whole scheme. The same cameras that used to follow him with admiration were now hunting him down. Reporters were camped outside his building, and his old friends were nowhere to be found. His whole empire started to crumble. I heard he stormed into his office, trying to give orders, but no one was listening anymore. His own team wouldn't even look him in the eye. Some had already quit. Then the federal agents showed up with papers in their hands, and it was like the whole building could finally breathe again, knowing his time was over. And Madison? Of course, she was long gone. She'd already released statements to the press, making herself out to be the poor, innocent victim of a terrible man. Her betrayal was perfect, leaving Alexander to face the music all by himself. He tried to save face with a press conference, but it was a disaster. He stood up there, in front of all those flashing cameras, and you could hear his voice tremble as he denied everything. I am innocent, he said. These are lies from a bitter ex-wife. But nobody believed him. Reporters were shouting, waving the documents Daniel had found. Then one of them yelled, Mr. Grant, is it true your mistress is testifying against you? That question hit him like a punch. He just froze, and his mask completely crumbled. The cameras caught it all. The fear, the sweat. That picture of him, once so powerful, now just a broken man, was everywhere. Daniel and I watched a little of it from my hospital room, with the baby sleeping peacefully in my arms. He turned the sound down on the TV and gave me this little smile. "It's happening, Olivia," he said. "He's finally getting what he deserves." I looked at the screen for a moment, and my heart felt so calm. Seeing him used to tear me apart, but holding my daughter, all I felt was a sense of peace. That wasn't my world anymore. He was just a man destroyed by his own greed. It wasn't long before the official charges came down: fraud, embezzlement. They set his bail so high that no one would help him. They froze his accounts, took the penthouse, and his name was ruined. For so many years, he thought he was above it all. But in the end, it wasn't some business rival who took him down. It was the woman he thought was nothing. And while his world collapsed, I was quietly starting my new life, finally free of his shadow. Those first few weeks with my daughter were a beautiful kind of chaos. My little apartment was filled with late-night cries and quiet songs. I was always tired and barely had time to eat. But whenever I looked at her tiny face, none of that mattered. I realized I was crying again, but for the first time in a long time, they were happy tears. I named her Grace. It felt right, a name that was both strong and peaceful. "You're my Grace," I'd whisper to her all the time. "You're the one who saved me." Daniel was a rock through all of it, always there with groceries or just to make sure I was okay. Then one evening, he told me he wanted me to meet someone. "Olivia," he said so gently, "there's a person I think you should meet. He can help you, not just with legal things, but with building a real future." I was hesitant, I admit. The last thing I wanted was to trust a stranger. But when Ethan Reynolds walked in, I knew right away he was different. He wasn't flashy or arrogant, like Alexander. He was a billionaire, sure, but in the tech world. He was calm, down to earth, and his eyes had this kindness in them that told you he'd known his own share of heartache. He just shook my hand and looked at me with respect, not pity. "I've heard a lot about you," he said, his voice so soft, "and about how much courage it took to do what you did." It felt strange to hear that. I wasn't used to anyone praising me for anything anymore, but the way he said it, it just felt real. Over the next few weeks, Ethan started coming by. He made it seem like it was about business at first. He'd seen my design work and gave me a few small projects just to see what I could do. "My office needs a little soul," he'd say with a laugh. "All this technology is great, but it doesn't make a place feel like home." I was still cautious, but getting back to work felt wonderful. It reminded me who I was before Alexander tried to make me forget. Ethan paid me well, listened to my ideas, and slowly helped me learn to trust myself again. It wasn't just about the work, though. Ethan would stay and just talk. And more importantly, he would listen. He'd ask about Grace, about what I was like as a kid, about dreams I'd long forgotten. He never once pushed me for more than I was ready to give. One afternoon, I watched him holding Grace, just rocking her so gently, and I felt something I hadn't felt in forever: hope. For so long, the men in my life had only brought me pain, but here was someone who saw me, the real me, and valued me for it. I wasn't ready to call it love, not then, but it was a start. For the longest time, I truly believed my heart was broken for good. But it wasn't. Holding Grace, with Ethan right there beside me, I finally saw that getting better wasn't just about surviving. It was about letting myself be happy again. Over the next few months, my whole life began to change. That woman who used to hide in her little apartment, feeling so ashamed and small, she just wasn't me anymore. I felt stronger, and maybe a little wiser. With my baby in my arms and Ethan cheering on my small design business, I rebuilt my life from scratch. And my friendship with Ethan, well, it started to feel like something more. He was just so patient, never pushing me or asking for more than I could give. He made me laugh again, and he showed me that love didn't have to hurt or be a game. It was funny, really. Alexander always belittled my dreams, but Ethan championed them. Alexander vanished when I was at my lowest, and Ethan just showed up, no questions asked. He was there for all of it, the late night feedings, my business worries, or just sitting with me while Grace slept. I'll never forget one night on his terrace, looking out over the river when this incredible sense of peace washed over me. He gently put his arm around my shoulders. I remember he said so softly, "You've come so far. You should be proud." My heart just swelled, and I told him I couldn't have done it without his help. But he just shook his head and said, "You did it because you're stronger than you know. I just helped you see it." When our eyes met, for the first time since everything fell apart, I didn't look away. I just soaked in the warmth of his gaze, and in that moment, I knew I was ready, ready for a love that was real and steady. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Alexander's life was heading in a very different direction. His trial was everywhere. The evidence was overwhelming, and one by one, his old cronies turned on him. I heard Madison even testified, cool as a cucumber, painting him as the villain while she played the innocent victim. The jury didn't buy any of his desperate excuses. That powerful man I once knew was sent to prison for years. They sold his fancy apartment, dismantled his company. His name was a disgrace. I saw photos of him being led away in handcuffs, his face just a twisted mess of anger and regret. But there was no one left in his corner. He had destroyed everyone around him, and in the end, he was completely alone. I never went to the trial, you know. I didn't have to. Seeing him fail wasn't my victory. That was just karma, I suppose. My real victory was holding my daughter, living my life without his shadow hanging over me, and finally building a future that was all mine. For Grace's first birthday, Ethan threw a little party at his home. It was filled with good friends and so much warmth. It was everything I once thought I'd lost forever. I remember watching him toss Grace in the air, hearing her squeal with pure joy, and my eyes filled with happy tears. He caught my eye and smiled. "You both are my family now," he said. And right then, I knew. I had lost everything, but what I found was worth so much more. A daughter who gave me purpose, and a partner who showed me real love. You see, my story isn't about being defeated. It's about getting back up, about healing, and about knowing that nothing can stop you when you decide to fight for your own happiness. Life can knock you down in the most brutal ways. It really can. But sometimes, it's the things that stand in your way that end up showing you the path forward. At least, that's what I learned. I managed to turn all that pain into growth, and that loss into a new kind of strength, creating a life better than I'd ever imagined. So if you ever face your own heartaches, my dear, remember that. Those hard times don't get to define you. You are the one who decides what comes next. If this story taught me anything, it's that you should always share your hope with people who need it. It stirred something in me, and I hope it does for you too. Together, we can always find some light, even in the darkest of times. And so, dear friend, that is the story of Olivia Bennett. A woman who walked into a ballroom believing she had everything and walked out with nothing but a baby in her belly and a broken heart in her hands. Yet somehow, from those ashes, she built a life more beautiful than the one that was stolen from her. If you're still with me after all of this, I want you to pause for just a moment. Because Olivia's story is not simply about betrayal, or revenge, or even justice. It's about something far deeper, something every woman, every mother, every person who has ever been cast aside needs to hear tonight. The first lesson is this: your worth is never, ever defined by the person who fails to see it. Alexander Grant looked at Olivia every single day and saw someone small, someone replaceable, someone who didn't fit the image of the empire he wanted to build. But his blindness was never her flaw, it was his. The tragedy of a man like Alexander is that he mistook loyalty for weakness, kindness for naivety, and a woman's quiet strength for something he could step on. And by the time he realized what he had destroyed, it was already too late. Remember this, my friend. When someone chooses to walk away from you, they are not revealing who you are. They are revealing who they have always been underneath. The second lesson is that humiliation is never the end of your story. It is often the beginning of a new one. When Olivia walked out of that ballroom, she believed her life was over. She hid in a small Brooklyn apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping, drowning in the shame of what had been done to her in front of the whole world. But here's the beautiful truth. Shame does not belong to the one who was wronged. Shame belongs to the one who committed the wrong. And the moment Olivia understood that, the moment she looked in the mirror and stopped apologizing for existing, her entire life began to turn. So if you are in that small apartment tonight, whether it's an actual room or just a dark place in your heart, please hear me. This chapter is not your whole book. Keep turning the page. The third lesson is perhaps the most important of all. When you have something to protect, you discover a strength you never knew lived inside you. Olivia didn't fight for herself at first. She fought because a tiny heartbeat was growing inside her, depending on her to keep going. She fought for her daughter, Grace. And isn't that the secret all mothers eventually learn? That the love we carry for our children has the power to turn fear into fire and silence into a voice that shakes empires. If you are a mother watching this right now, I want you to know you are stronger than you believe, stronger than the men who doubted you, stronger than the storms life has thrown at you, and stronger than the version of yourself you see on your most exhausted days. The fourth lesson is about karma, and it is a lesson we must speak of gently. Alexander lost everything, not because Olivia plotted revenge, but because he had already planted the seeds of his own destruction long before she walked back into his boardroom. Madison didn't betray him because Olivia asked her to. She betrayed him because a man who betrays his own wife has already taught the world how little his loyalty is worth. This is the truth life teaches us again and again. What we do in the shadows eventually walks into the light. So do not waste your precious energy planning revenge against those who hurt you. Build your life instead. Build it so beautifully, so peacefully, so full of love and purpose, that the day they look back at what they lost, your very existence becomes the answer they were running from. And the final lesson, my dear friend, is this: real love does not hurt. Real love does not humiliate. Real love does not make you small. Real love, the kind Ethan showed Olivia, is quiet, patient, and safe. It is someone who holds your baby while you sleep. Someone who believes in your dreams when no one else does. Someone who doesn't need to control you, to love you. If you are settling for anything less tonight, I want you to remember Olivia. Remember that she almost gave up her entire life for a man who never deserved even one of her tears. And remember that the love she finally found was waiting on the other side of the courage to walk away. So tonight, before you close your eyes, place your hand on your own heart. Feel it beating. That heart has survived every single thing that has ever tried to break it. That heart is still here, still fighting, still capable of loving and being loved in the most beautiful way. You are not the woman he threw away. You are the woman who is about to rise. If this story touched your heart, if Olivia's journey reminded you of your own strength or the strength of a woman you love, please take a moment to show your support. Hit the like button so more hearts can find this story. Leave a comment below and tell me which lesson spoke to you the most. Share this video with a friend, a sister, a mother, or a daughter who needs to be reminded tonight that she is never, ever alone. And of course, subscribe to our channel for more powerful, true-to-life stories of courage, love, and the unstoppable power of women who refuse to stay broken. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until our next story, take care of your heart, protect your peace, and never forget your worth. Disclaimer: this content has been researched, written, and carefully edited by hand by our team for the sole purpose of sharing meaningful stories and life lessons with our viewers. All characters, names, and events are fictional dramatizations intended for inspiration and emotional reflection. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, is purely coincidental.